Welcome in, everyone, ready to dive deep into the Dutch housing market.
Sounds like a timely topic.
It really is. We've got reports, analyses, first-hand accounts, the whole shebang.
Trying to get a real grip on this housing crisis.
Yeah, figure out what's fueling it, how it's impacting people's lives, and what's being done about it.
It's complicated for sure.
Yeah.
But that's why we're here to break it down.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. How bad is this housing shortage in the Netherlands? The numbers I've seen are pretty alarming.
They're really striking. Imagine a city the size of Rotterdam just gone.
Wow.
That's basically how many homes the Netherlands needs to build by 2030. Nearly 1 million.
1 million.
But the problem is construction is lagging way behind.
So it's not just a theoretical shortage.
No, it's a real people are struggling to find a place to live kind of shortage.
You know what I'm curious about?
Yeah.
This average wait time for social housing, I've heard it's incredibly long.
Oh, it is. The average wait is 7 years.
7 years.
And in some places, it's almost 20.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah. Hundreds of thousands of people are just stuck on waiting lists.
Across how many cities?
Over 1,000.
Wow. It's no wonder people are taking to the streets with these woon protest demonstrations.
Exactly. People are frustrated. They're fed up. They need housing, and they need it now.
And you can't blame them. I can only imagine the stress of being on a waiting list for that long.
Especially when you think about trying to buy a home.
Yeah, what's the average price these days?
Over 450,000 euros.
You're kidding me.
Nope, that's the reality.
So for a young person trying to enter the housing market, it's basically impossible.
It's a huge barrier for a lot of people.
So what's behind this perfect storm of housing woes?
Oh, a few things. Population growth is one factor.
Right.
More people obviously means more demand for homes.
Right, more competition.
Exactly. And on top of that, construction costs have gone through the roof. We're talking a 15 to 20% increase.
What's driving that increase?
Well, everything, really. Energy prices, material shortages, all those global economic factors are having a huge impact.
Okay, so more people, higher costs, and I imagine finding land to build on is a challenge in itself.
Absolutely. The Netherlands is a small, densely populated country. Land is scarce, and it's expensive.
So finding suitable locations is a major obstacle.
It is. There's fierce competition for building sites, and that drives up the price of land even further.
I see. So you've got limited land, rising costs, and then there's the bureaucratic side of things. I've heard the permitting process in the Netherlands can be pretty tough.
Yeah, it can definitely be a headache. Permitting delays can add years to a project.
Years.
Yeah, and that obviously drives up the costs.
Okay, so it's like every step forward, there's a hurdle to overcome.
Pretty much. And then you add in the political controversies, and it gets even more complicated.
That's what I wanted to ask you about. There's been a lot of discussion about the government's handling of social housing, specifically for refugees.
Yes, it's been a hot-button issue.
What are people saying about it?
Well, some feel that the government is prioritizing refugees over Dutch citizens in terms of social housing allocation. And that's added fuel to the fire of those woon protest movements we talked about.
Right, so it's not just about economics and construction. It's about social dynamics and political decisions as well.
Exactly. It's all intertwined.
It's a real human story, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So let's talk about that human impact for a minute. You mentioned Amsterdam's rental market. Just how high are those rents?
Oh, they're eye-watering. You're looking at 1,500 to 2,000 euros per month.
Seriously?
Yeah, and that's just the average.
Wow, it's no wonder home ownership has become a distant dream for many people.
It has, especially for younger generations. The home ownership rate among young adults has dropped below 30%.
It's a staggering statistic.
It is, and it has ripple effects on everything: savings, family formation, career choices, you name it.
So this housing crisis is affecting people's entire lives, not just their ability to find a place to live.
That's the key takeaway here. This isn't just about housing. It's about people's hopes, dreams, and their ability to build a future.
It makes you wonder, can this market even be fixed? I know the government has announced a plan to build 980,000 homes by 2030.
Yeah, it's an ambitious goal, but considering everything we've just discussed, there's a lot of skepticism about whether it's actually achievable.
So what are the alternative solutions being considered?
Well, one idea is to build up rather than out.
You mean high-rises?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially in densely populated cities, it's a way to maximize the limited space.
That makes sense, but I imagine there might be some resistance to that.
Oh, for sure. Some people worry about preserving the traditional Dutch cityscape.
Right, those charming canal houses.
Exactly.
So what other options are on the table
Another idea is expanding construction into rural areas.
where there might be more land available?
Yeah, but that could create conflict over preserving valuable farmland.
It's a tough balance to strike.
It is.
So, denser urbanization, expanding into rural areas. Are there any other ideas?
Well, there's always the option of encouraging private sector investment through things like tax incentives.
To make building more profitable for developers.
Exactly.
Okay, interesting.
And there are some specific projects gaining attention. Have you heard about ExtraCAD?
I don't think so.
It's a proposal to create smaller-scale housing developments in rural areas, sort of woven into the existing fabric of these communities.
Ah, so it's about finding ways to increase density without drastically changing the character of these villages.
Right, and this project alone could create 95,000 new homes.
Wow, that's significant.
But let's not forget about the elephant in the room.
Oh, you mean real estate investors?
Mm-hmm. Are they part of the problem or part of the solution?
Yeah, there are definitely strong opinions on both sides.
That's for sure.
So what's the argument against investors?
Some people accuse them of hoarding properties, driving up prices, and making housing unattainable for ordinary people.
Okay, I can see that perspective.
But then others argue that investors can actually help by building new properties and increasing the overall housing supply.
So maybe it's a case of too much of a good thing.
It might be. There's no doubt there's been a rapid increase in the number of investor-owned properties, and there are concerns about vacant properties being held for speculation.
Right, which doesn't help anyone who needs a place to live.
Exactly. And then there's the practice of buying properties and renting them out at inflated prices.
I imagine that creates a lot of resentment.
It does, especially among people who are struggling to afford a place to live.
It feels like a real catch-22.
It is. But it's important to remember that not all investors are created equal. We came across a story of an investor in Delft who's converting office spaces into affordable housing.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he feels unfairly vilified. He argues that he's trying to be part of the solution.
So there are nuances to this investor story.
Absolutely. And it seems like the government is trying to navigate these complexities with policies aimed at regulating investors.
Like what?
Well, you've got things like the self-occupancy obligation, which requires buyers to actually live in the property they purchase.
So they can't just buy it to rent it out.
Right. And then there's the expansion of the points system.
Remind me how that works.
Basically, it's a way to control rental prices. They assign points based on a property size, amenities, things like that, and landlords can only charge rent up to a certain limit based on those points.
So the government is trying to find a balance between regulating the market and not stifling development.
Exactly. And these policies have the potential to help, but there are also concerns about unintended consequences.
Like what?
Well, for instance, the self-occupancy obligation might discourage some investors, which could actually decrease the overall housing supply.
Right, less investment, less construction.
And the point system, though well-intentioned, can be tricky to enforce. Landlords might find loopholes or cut corners on quality to stay within those rent limits.
So finding that sweet spot in regulation is easier said than done.
It definitely is.
Speaking of tricky situations, have you heard about these Flexwoningen?
The Flexwoningen.
They sound intriguing.
Think of them as flexible housing units. Basically temporary prefabricated homes designed to address the immediate shortage.
Okay, so a quick fix kind of solution.
Yeah, sort of like a Band-Aid on a larger wound.
Are they being implemented widely?
Not as much as you might think. We came across a story from the town of Putten, where plans to build these Flexwoningen were met with a lot of local pushback.
Really? Why?
Well, there were concerns about who would end up living in these units.
Ah, the classic not in my backyard sentiment.
Exactly. And there were worries about the impact on green spaces, since these homes are often placed in existing open areas.
It seems like every solution comes with its own set of challenges.
That's the nature of this crisis, unfortunately.
So what are some of the hurdles to implementing Flexwoningen nationwide?
Well, finding suitable locations is one, obviously. Keeping them affordable is another. And then there's the whole question of managing the temporary nature of these dwellings.
What happens to residents after their temporary stay ends?
That's the big question.
We can't just keep moving people from one temporary solution to another.
Exactly. We need sustainable solutions, not just quick fixes.
And one of the biggest worries is that focusing on these Flexwoningen might actually divert resources away from building permanent housing.
That's a valid concern. It's important to keep the long-term goals in sight.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. the scale of the housing shortage, the factors driving it, the potential solutions, the political debates, even these temporary flex zoning in.
It's a complex picture with no easy answers.
That's for sure. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to go back to something you said earlier. Not all investors are created equal.
Right.
It made me think about all the different perspectives in this housing crisis. We focus mainly on those struggling to find housing, but it's important to acknowledge that there are other stakeholders involved.
Yep.
So let's delve into that a bit more. We have investors, developers, local communities, each with their own motivations and challenges. How can we understand and empathize with all these different viewpoints as we search for solutions?
That's the key, isn't it? It's about recognizing that there are no simple good guys and bad guys in this story.
Right, it's about seeing the nuances, the competing interests, and the need for collaboration.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the role of the government. How can policymakers create a framework that balances these competing interests?
That's the million-euro question. It's a tall order for sure. It requires a holistic approach that considers not just housing supply, but also things like transportation jobs, community development.
It's about building thriving communities, not just houses.
Exactly. It's about moving away from siloed approaches and toward a more integrated collaborative model where the government, the private sector, and communities work together to find solutions that benefit everyone.
That sounds ideal, but is it realistic?
It's definitely challenging, but I believe it's possible. And it's encouraging to see so many people tackling these issues, thinking outside the box and pushing for change.
It shows that even when faced with enormous challenges, human ingenuity and collective action can still make a difference.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
And even though the path forward might not be perfectly clear, just having this conversation, digging into these issues and searching for solutions is a huge step in the right direction.
I agree. So we've explored the problem, the potential solutions, the various perspectives, and those glimmers of hope.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But before we go any further, I want to circle back to those flex Moningen for a moment.
Ah, yes. Back to the housing band-aids.
Exactly. They're meant to be a temporary solution, but as we've discussed, they come with their own set of challenges and potential downsides.
For sure.
So my question is, can flex Wonemen be more than just a band-aid? Can they actually play a role in a long-term solution to this housing crisis?
It's a great question,
Yeah.
and it's one that's being debated extensively. On one hand, they do offer a relatively quick and adaptable way to boost housing supply, especially for those in dire need, and they could be a testing ground for innovative building techniques and community designs.
I see that. So they could be like mini laboratories for exploring new ways of living and creating more sustainable, affordable housing options.
Exactly. But we have to be careful about relying too heavily on temporary solutions.
Right. We can't let flex Woningen become a crutch that prevents us from investing in permanent housing construction.
And we need to make sure that these temporary communities are well integrated into the larger social fabric.
They shouldn't be isolated pockets.
Right.
Okay, so it's not a simple yes or no answer.
It's not. It's about using flex Woningen strategically as one part of a bigger multi-pronged approach.
One tool in the toolbox.
Exactly. And recognizing that they're not a cure-all, but they can be a valuable tool for alleviating some of the immediate pressure while we work towards those more lasting solutions.
So flex Woningen, a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture.
Exactly.
And speaking of the bigger picture, we need to talk about those long-term implications of this crisis for Dutch society. We've touched on the immediate impacts, but what about the ripple effects that could reshape the Netherlands for years to come?
That's what we'll be unpacking in the next part of our deep dive. We've talked about how this housing crunch is hitting individuals and families hard. You know, their finances, their stress levels, that uncertainty hanging over their heads. But now let's zoom out. Look at the bigger picture. What happens to Dutch society if this keeps dragging on?
Yeah, you're talking about those domino effects, those ripples that can turn into waves and reshape the whole landscape.
Exactly. Think about it. If a big chunk of the population is struggling to keep a roof over their heads, it holds back the economy. Less money to invest, less money to start businesses, less money to spend in general, it all adds up.
It's like the whole system gets stuck in a rut.
Precisely. And then there are the social implications. We touched on those rising social and political tensions, the nurs versus them mentality that takes root when resources feel scarce. But beyond that, imagine social mobility, that idea that you can work hard and move up in the world. If housing is out of reach, it's harder to break free from existing inequalities.
So not only are people struggling to afford a place to live, but it could create deeper divides in society.
That's the real worry. It can erode trust in institutions and even threaten political stability. Remember those protests, the wound protests. They're a sign that people are feeling pushed to their limits.
It paints a pretty bleak picture, this housing crisis, potentially undermining the very fabric of Dutch society.
It's definitely a cause for concern.
Yeah.
And it underscores the point that this is about more than just bricks and mortar. It's about fairness, opportunity, and ensuring that everyone has a chance to build a decent life, no matter their background.
So it's not just an economic issue, it's a moral one, too.
Absolutely. And this is where leadership comes in. Policymakers need to make tough choices, invest in long-term solutions, and make sure the well-being of all citizens is a top priority.
Right. It's about creating a future where everyone has a place to call home. And I don't just mean a physical structure, but that feeling of belonging, of being part of a community, of having a stake in society.
Beautifully put. That sense of belonging is crucial. And it brings us back to those different perspectives we were talking about earlier. We've heard from those struggling to find housing, but what about the other players in this game?
Like those investors, some are in it for the quick buck, but others genuinely want to help address the shortage.
Exactly. And then you have developers juggling regulations, permits financial risks. And let's not forget, local communities who want new housing, but also want to preserve the character of their neighborhoods.
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube. You have to get all the sides aligned to find the solution.
That's a great analogy. And it highlights the need for empathy and understanding. We have to see things from multiple angles to find solutions that work for everyone.
So how do we even begin to tackle a problem this complex, this multifaceted? Where do we start?
Well, we've already explored some of the potential solutions being debated. Denser urban development, expanding into rural areas, encouraging private investment. But beyond those big picture strategies, there are also some really innovative ideas bubbling up at the grassroots level.
Okay, now we're talking. Tell me about some of these creative approaches. I'm always inspired by people thinking outside the box.
One trend that's gaining traction is co-housing. Imagine communities designed around shared spaces and resources. It's not just about making housing more affordable, it's about fostering a sense of community of people supporting each other.
That's a really interesting concept. It almost sounds like a modern-day take on a traditional village where everyone looks out for each other.
Exactly. And then there are those initiatives focused on giving old buildings a new lease on life. We talked about that investor in Delft converting office space into apartments. That kind of ingenuity can unlock a lot of potential in our cities.
It's like finding hidden treasure, turning underutilized spaces into vibrant new communities. Are there other examples of that kind of repurposing?
Definitely. Think about old factories, warehouses, even schools. They can all be reimagined to create housing. And then you have architects and designers pushing the boundaries with new materials and building techniques, making housing more sustainable and affordable.
I'm really struck by how much innovation is happening in response to this crisis. It's like necessity really is the mother of invention.
It truly is. And it's not just about the physical structures themselves. There are also groups working to educate people about their housing rights and empower them to advocate for change.
So it's a multi-pronged approach, from those innovative designs and community initiatives to empowering individuals to have a voice. It feels like there's a groundswell of momentum building.
There is. And that shift in thinking, that willingness to embrace new ideas and challenge the old ways of doing things, that might be the most promising development of all.
It's a reminder that even in the face of these enormous challenges, we can find creative solutions when we work together and think differently.
Exactly. And while the path forward might not be perfectly clear, just the fact that we're having this conversation, that we're exploring these complex issues and searching for answers, that's a huge step in the right direction.
I agree. And speaking of finding answers, before we move on, I want to circle back to those flex zoning and we discussed earlier. They're meant to be a temporary solution, but we also talked about some of the potential downsides.
Right, like finding suitable locations, ensuring they're affordable, and figuring out what happens to residents once their temporary stay is over.
Exactly. We can't just keep shuffling people from one temporary fix to the next. So where do you stand on this? Can flex zoning be more than just a Band-Aid solution? Could they actually play a role in the long-term solution to the housing crisis?
It's a great question, and it's one that requires a nuanced approach. On the one hand, these flexible housing units offer a relatively quick and adaptable way to increase housing supply, especially for those who need it most urgently. And they can serve as testing grounds for innovative building methods and community designs.
I see that. They could be like mini laboratories for exploring new ways of living and creating more sustainable and affordable housing options.
Precisely. But we have to be cautious about leaning too heavily on temporary fixes. We can't let flex zoning divert resources away from investing in long-term permanent housing construction. And it's absolutely vital to make sure that these temporary communities are woven into the larger social fabric, not treated as separate entities.
Right. It's about fostering inclusion and a sense of belonging, not just providing temporary shelter.
Exactly. And that requires careful planning, community engagement, and a clear vision for how flex loaning fit into a long-term strategy for addressing the housing crisis.
So it's not a black and white issue. It's about using flex loaning in strategically as part of a larger multi-pronged approach that encompasses both short-term relief and long-term solutions.
That's a good way to put it. And it's also about acknowledging that flex loaning, while valuables, aren't a magic bullet. They're one tool in the toolbox, but we need a whole set of tools to truly address this complex issue.
Okay, so flex loaning in a piece of the puzzle, but not the whole picture. And speaking of the bigger picture, we need to talk about the long-term implications of this crisis for Dutch society. We've touched on the immediate impacts, but what about the ripple effects that could reshape the Netherlands for years to come?
That's a crucial conversation, and it's one we need to have now. This isn't just about housing. It's about the future of the Netherlands.
Okay, so we've really gone deep on this Dutch housing crisis. Sky-high prices, those long waiting lists, the creative solutions popping up, even those temporary flex loaning in.
We've covered a lot of ground for sure.
We have. But now I want to look even further down the road. What happens if this doesn't get fixed?
The long view.
Yeah, what are the long-term consequences for Dutch society?
It's the big question, isn't it? We've talked about the immediate impacts, people struggling with rent, young couples putting off having kids, that feeling of being squeezed out of your own city.
Yeah, it's a tough reality for a lot of people.
It is. And if it continues, those ripples turn into a tsunami, reshaping the whole landscape of the Netherlands.
Okay, paint that picture for me. What are we talking about here?
Well, for starters, the economy. If a huge chunk of the population is spending most of their income just to keep a roof over their heads, it holds the whole country back. Less money to invest, less money to start businesses, less to spend in the economy.
So the whole country could become poorer because of this.
That's the fear. It creates a vicious cycle. The lack of affordable housing drags down the economy, which then makes it even harder to solve the housing problem.
And it's not just about money, right? We've talked about social unrest, those divisions between different groups in society.
Right. When housing becomes a luxury, only the wealthy can afford it, it creates a more divided society. Less opportunity for those who are already at a disadvantage.
So less social mobility.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It can breed resentment, distrust, even instability. Remember those wound protests?
Yeah.
They're a sign that people are feeling the pressure reaching a boiling point.
It's a bleak outlook, honestly. It feels like we're talking about the very soul of Dutch society.
You're hitting the nail on the head. This goes way beyond just housing policy. It's about creating a society that's fair, equitable, with opportunity for everyone, regardless of income or background, making sure everyone has a chance to not just survive, but thrive.
So what needs to happen? Who needs to step up?
It starts with leadership. Policymakers, those with the power to shape the future of housing in the Netherlands. They need to show some courage, make tough decisions, even if they're not popular.
Like what?
They need to invest in long-term solutions. Prioritize the well-being of all citizens, not just the well-off.
Right.
Recognize that this isn't just about economics. It's a moral obligation to make sure that everyone has a safe, affordable place to live.
A place to call home. Not just four walls and a roof, but a place where they feel like they belong, where they have a stake in the future, a chance to build a good life.
Beautifully said. And that means thinking differently, embracing new ideas and challenging the old ways, working together across sectors, across communities to find solutions that benefit everyone.
This has been pretty intense, eye-opening, really. We've uncovered some tough realities about this housing crisis.
We have.
And the potential consequences for the whole country. But I also feel like we've seen glimmers of hope, those innovative ideas and people fighting for a better future.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that even when things seem bleak, there's always hope. It's often in those moments of crisis that we see the best in people. Ingenuity, resilience, the willingness to come together and build something better.
So where does that leave our listener? What can they do? What should they be thinking about as we wrap up?
Stay informed. Stay engaged. This isn't just a problem for politicians to solve. It affects everyone. Read up on the different perspectives. Talk to your friends, your family, your elected officials.
Right. Advocate for change. Support those working towards a better housing system.
Become an active participant, not just a spectator.
Don't underestimate the power of individual action.
Right. Support local initiatives.
Yeah.
Volunteer, raise awareness among your friends. It all adds up.
It's a reminder that we're all in this together, that the future of the Netherlands depends on all of us working together to find those solutions.
Well said.
Well, I think it's time for us to surface from this deep dive. We've covered so much, from construction costs and zoning regulations to those broader impacts on society, the economy, the political landscape.
It's been a journey.
It has. But hopefully our listener has emerged with a better understanding of the issue and that sense of hope that solutions are possible.
Definitely. This housing crisis is a complex problem, but it's not insurmountable. With collective action, creative thinking, and a commitment to building a more just and equitable society.
We can create a future where everyone has a place to call home.
Nicely put.
Okay. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, keep diving deep.